So we need to take a look at is how do we estimate an agile project? So the problem basically is that you really don't have the ability to do a lot of upfront planning. In fact, it's one of the hallmarks of an agile process that you defer the planning to later stages in the process where you have more information to make the proper decisions and to do the proper planning. One of the drawbacks often of planning too much upfront in a waterfall project is that we often have to estimate project costs, schedules, tasks, task dependencies before we often know who's actually assigned to a project and before we have a solid understanding of the requirements. And of course, as we have already discovered, requirements change over time. Requirements are perishable. They grow, they shrink, they change, they get modified as a project progresses. So by definition, any kind of an estimate you do for schedule, for time, for costs is by definition going to change. So in the agile world, how do we deal with this? How do we provide an estimate for project costs? How do we provide an estimate for time? At the end of the day, of course, every client, every manager, every user wants to know when are you going to be done and how much is all of this going to cost me? Or, hey, I got $75,000 to spend on this. I got to get this done by December 1st. What can I have for $75,000? Can I get, some set of requirements done for $75,000? And can it be done by my deadline? So these are legitimate questions that your stakeholders are going to have, and you're going to have an answer for that. So what do you do? Well, a lot of it is built around the way that we capture requirements in Agile. Remember that in an Agile environment, we generally do a lot of the requirements work up front by building the requirements as a set of user stories. And often user stories are very simple. They're always written from the perspective of as a, let's say, renter, I want to make my monthly rent payment so that, rent payment online, so that I don't incur late fees when checks get lost. All right, that would be an example of a user story that is a requirement for some kind of a website where people can pay their rent automatically for an apartment building or maybe for some kind of an association. Whatever, it's not really that important. The point is you have lots of these types of user stories. And commonly in an agile process, we use a very lo-fi approach to tracking these. We put them on index cards, and we often actually pin those index cards on walls or on corkboards. Now, of course, that only works if the development team is co-located. That means they're all in the same sort of overall physical space, but it doesn't really work when they're not co-located. In that case, you need some kind of an electronic way of tracking, some electronic pinboard or corkboard. And often tools like Trello are very commonly used for that. And there's a lot of other Scrum board software systems available. Even Jira does some of that. And there's literally dozens of them that you can use for this purpose. Many of them are either called Scrum board software, Agile project management software. Some call them Kanban boards or Scrum Con boards. Whatever you want to call them. But the point is that they basically allow you to track these user stories. So then what do we do? Well, generally you identify these stories at the beginning of a project during a requirements workshop. You identify additional ones as you go through each sprint. And you very likely identify many of them at the end of a sprint during the review of the product you've built in that sprint with your stakeholders. So you've got lots of these. But then the key thing is, every time you identify a new story, or if you don't want to do it every time as soon as you find a story, maybe periodically once a week, every couple of days, at the end of each sprint before the new sprint starts, you score the stories. So you have a story, you write it down in the index card. As a user or as a renter or as a whatever, I want to so that. You always write it using that kind of canonical form. As a, state the user role, I want to, state the requirement or the need, so that, and state the reason why that need's important. What essentially business problem that particular requirement solves. So again, getting back to this, you have these cards, you have lots of these cards. There's tons and tons of these cards on your whiteboard. Each one of them contains one user story. But then one of the things you want to do is you want to score that. You want to put a score up here. Now the score is used for estimation, but the score is not an estimate of how long the story takes to implement. But what we do instead is the team during a scoring session takes some number of user stories and scores them by identifying the overall complexity of it. Now, of course, everybody defines complexity differently, but you ask every person on the development team to score the card. Now, there are lots of scales you can use, but the most common scale is a modified Fibonacci scale that basically says, well, this is a complexity of 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 20, 40, 80. So the first few numbers are the Fibonacci numbers. The other ones, of course, are not real Fibonacci numbers. They're modified. They're kind of just made up numbers that are a little bit bigger. The reason why we use that scale is because it is not equidistant. It's a non-equal interval scale, and it basically means that it draws the simple stories and the complex stories away from the pack. If you use a regular scale from 0 to 100 or 0 to 10 or some other type of linear scale, there is a tendency that the majority of the stories tend to be scored close to the mean. You end up with a somewhat normal distribution, which means most things cluster around the mean. So it's very hard to know what the true complexity of a story is and to know which ones are simple, which ones are medium hard, and which ones are really hard. So the modified Fibonacci scale kind of forces that drawing away of the outliers from the mean. Now, how do you run a scoring session that does this? Well, it means that as a development team, you get together. Whoever is on that team and who's going to write code gets together. Scrum Master, Project Manager presents a story to be scored and says, hey, here's the story I want to score. As a renter, I want to make my monthly payment online so that I don't incur late fees when checks get lost. That's what I want to score. How do we do this? And you ask everybody to go and think about this. And we use Delphi to do this. Or to be more precise, a modified version of Delphi. It's actually often called planning poker. In fact, what you do to speed this up, you give everybody pre-printed cards. You can actually buy them. There's actually software you can get, or apps you can get for your phones that are Scrum cards. And you ask everybody, hey, go think about this. How hard do you think this is to do? Now, the actual number doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you score relative consistently. That basically means if you score one story as 3 and one as 8, it means the story that you give 8 points to is about twice as hard to do than a story with 3. The actual number itself doesn't matter. Then, everybody sort of thinks about this, and based on their experiences, they pick a card, or they pick a number from 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, and so on. And somebody might say, well, I think this is an 8. Somebody says, well, I think this is a 20. Somebody else says, well, I think this is a 40. This person says, well, it's definitely an 80. This one person says, well, I think it's like a 13. They talk about it, and they, like with Delphi, ask the low estimator and the highest estimator to share their insights why one thinks it's so simple to do and one thinks it's so incredibly hard to do. Maybe they know something that everybody else does not know. And we have a discussion. Like everything else in Scrum, you time box that discussion to a few minutes. So then you ask everybody to re-estimate. They toss out their initial estimates and you ask them to make a new estimate. And so now, of course, they're going to take the new information into account and they're probably going to be a lot closer. Now, you can keep going until everybody agrees. You simply take the average and say, well, in this particular case, 20 plus 20 plus 40 plus 40 plus 40 comes out to be, 160 divided by 5. That means it's about a 32 or so. Hopefully my math is right on this. So that's the story score. And you do that with all the stories. So every story is going to have a score. Every story has a score. Now, what does this help you do? Well, eventually, you're going to start your sprints. You're going to go through a 30-day, 14-day, whatever your sprint length is cycle. And in that cycle, you are working on a set of stories. At the end of the cycle, you look at all the stories you've implemented. The ones you really got done, that means they're tested, they're ready to be deployed, they're fully implemented. If they're not fully implemented, you put them back on the backlog at the end. You only count stories that have been fully implemented. Then you go through this, and at the end, you take all those story points of the completed stories. You take the completed stories and you add up the stories that have been completed. You add up their story points. So that basically gives you a number of points. So let's say you got one story done that had 9 points, one had 4 points, one had 11 points worth of complexity, one had 22 points. You add them all up. So you got 20, 42, 46. You got 46. And again, I'm assuming math is correct here. It's 9 plus 4 plus 11 plus 22. So you have 46 points of work that you've gotten done. We call that the velocity of your sprint. The amount of work you've gotten done in a fixed amount of time, or the amount of distance you traveled through your requirements universe in a fixed amount of time. So your velocity is 46 points. So that gives you some useful insight. It means that when you plan the next iteration, the next sprint, you guide your stakeholders. And you tell them you can pick off the backlog your most important stories you want us to work on, but when you add up their scores, try to be at around 46. Now, of course, over time, your your velocity increases. You're going to get better. As a team, you get worked in. You understand it better. Maybe some of the work you've done on previous stories suddenly is useful for a new story. So your velocity increases over time. Some studies have shown increases about 10% sprint over sprint until it eventually, of course, it levels off. So next iteration, you're probably going to get maybe about 50 to about 55 points worth of work done. So tell your users, tell your stakeholders, go pick about 50 to 55 points worth of work off the backlog. Of course, you're going to go through the cycle. At the end, you're going to go count how much you really accomplished. That's your new velocity. Now, of course, you can be a lot more creative about this. Instead of taking simply the velocity of the last sprint and adding 10%. Maybe you should take an average of the last 3 sprints. Maybe you should take a weighted average. You count the most recent sprint with a weight of 3. The sprint before with a weight of 2. The sprint before with a weight of 1. You get out 1 plus the sprint from 3 times ago, plus 2 times the velocity of the sprint that was next to last, and 3 times the velocity of the sprint that was most recent, and you divide all of that, of course, by the sum of the weights, by 6. And then you add 10% to that. And that's your new velocity estimate. It essentially becomes a forecasting problem. But eventually, of course, you kind of have an estimate for a steady state velocity. As you keep going through more and more sprints, the velocity is going to stabilize. So one of the things that's important about Scrum is you don't provide an estimate until you have a measurement of your velocity. Meaning all of your estimation is empirical. It's based on observation. But then how can you use this? And here's how you can use this. What if I know my velocity? Let's call it V. I still have my backlog of stories that I have not yet implemented. They're all scored. What if I take all those story points of all the stories still in the backlog and add them up? That's all the stories left in the backlog. If I add up all the user stories, I'm going to get my total number of points left, of work left to be done in the backlog. That's useful. Because if my velocity is, let's say, 50 points of work per sprint, and my backlog is 500 points worth of work, well, guess what? 500 divided by 50 equals 10 sprints of work left. If each sprint takes 2 weeks, I know I need 10 2-week sprints, or about 20 weeks of work. So I can use that for estimation. I can take my backlog, divide it by the velocity, and multiply that by my sprint length. That will give me my time left. So again, 500 points in the backlog divided by 50 points per sprint tells me I need 10 sprints. I multiply that by my time, let's say in terms of weeks, 2 weeks per sprint, time 10 sprints means I have 20 weeks worth of work left to do. That's a forward schedule. It basically tells me how much time do I have left given a fixed backlog. But we often don't have that. What we often have is something different. What we often have is that I have a backlog of stories, lots and lots and lots of stories, often a lot more than I have time for. And I often have a fixed amount of time. Let's say somebody tells me this has to be done by January 1st, or more precisely, December 31st. So then I can say, well, if it has to be done by December 31st, and it is now, let's say April 1, so I got April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November. People are going to take off time for 4th of July, Thanksgiving, Christmas. So let's take 1 month out. So I got 7 months left. So 7 months is about 14 2-week sprints, assuming that 2 weeks is my sprint length. So I got 14 weeks worth of time. Now, if my velocity is V, if I have some estimate of my velocity and I multiply that by the number of sprints, that will give me my capacity in story points. So let's say my velocity is 50 points per sprint, and I have 14 sprints. That will give me a capacity of, let's see, that's 500, 700 points. So now I can look at my backlog and say, well, if I know this story's points, let's say this story is 20 points worth of work, this story is 10 points worth of work, this is 11, this is 9, I can add those up. And if I keep adding, eventually I'm going to hit 700 points, my capacity. So whatever is above that in my sorted, prioritized from high priority to low priority backlog, it means that's in scope. And that, of course, means that's out of scope. So by calculating my capacity and then making sure my capacity is greater than the sum of all the story points that are supposed to be in scope, I know what it can realistically accomplish. Now, of course, somebody might say, well, that's great, but there's some stories down here that I really, really, really want. How do you get them? You have to move that watermark. You got to move that watermark somehow. Now, how does a watermark move? Well, the watermark moves if I increase my velocity or if I increase my number of sprints. So I can either add a sprint. So instead of being done by December 31st, I'm done by January 31st. Oh, sorry. Somewhere in January, yeah. I can increase my velocity. I get more work done per sprint. How does that happen? Well, got to look at why velocity decreases. So one common thing that, of course, people will automatically do is to say, well, just add more people to the project. Doesn't work. Brooks's law, right? Adding more people to a project that's late will very likely make it even later. In this particular case, we know exactly why. If I add another person to the project, it means that some of the people on the project have to take time out to get that person up to speed, which means their velocity drops, which means the total team's velocity drops because the new person is not yet contributing. So velocity drops instead of increasing. Another reason why people often have a low velocity is because they get sidetracked. They're often on multiple projects. They have to context switch between projects. They have to go to extra work that is outside the project. They get distracted. Solution? Don't distract people. Dedicate people to a project. Co-locate them. That's a ways of increasing velocity. Or, if you can't increase velocity, you can't increase the capacity, maybe you take one of the requirements that you think is very important, take it out, and put a different one in. You start to essentially force your stakeholders to prioritize. So those are some of the things that you can do to estimate in an agile environment. The key thing is that you have to measure your velocity, and the key thing is that you have to understand the complexity of your stories. So you need to agile estimate, you need to understand the velocity, and then you can make your calculations.